The chandeliers of the Vale estate glowed like 100 suns above polished marble, each crystal drop scattering the light across gowns and tuxedos that seemed lifted straight from glossy magazines. I sat at the edge of the ballroom, my navy silk dress more modest than anything in sight, but pressed and neat as I had intended. I told myself it was enough even as jeweled wrists and diamond chokers glittered in every direction. Then Damon, my only son, stood up at the microphone. He was radiant with the confidence of a man who believed he had finally arrived where he belonged next to Clarice Vale, in her sculpted satin gown, the Vale family, smiling like stage actors behind them. His voice carried through the speakers, rich and strong, laced with charm that had always made him popular since boyhood. "I want to thank everyone who made this day possible," he said, beaming at the guests, especially Clarice's family, whose generosity and taste made all of this beauty real. "As for my mom," he paused, glancing at me, smiling as though I were in on some private joke. "She's always kept things simple. I guess when you're broke, simplicity is the only option." Laughter rippled across the hall. Some guests chuckled politely. Others let out bolder laughs, wine-fueled and careless. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap, my cheeks hot, but my eyes dry. Broke. It was a word that tasted of rust, that carried the weight of every sacrifice I had made to put him through Yale, every extra shift at the district office, every penny-pinching decision that meant he had music lessons when I did not. I lowered my gaze to the tablecloth, smoothed its edge, and let the laughter wash over me. To rise in that moment to correct him would have fed the spectacle. So I kept my silence, though it felt like swallowing glass. Clarice leaned toward him at the head table, whispering something that made him laugh harder. Their friends clinked glasses, oblivious to the sting behind his words. I focused on the music from the quartet near the terrace, an old Cole Porter piece I used to hum while cooking Sunday dinners. I let the melody steady my pulse. Silence had always been my armor, and tonight, I needed its shield more than ever. "Funny, isn't it?" a voice murmured beside me. I turned. A man in his late 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, had leaned slightly in my direction. His face stirred a flicker of recognition, an old contact from my years consulting for the Energy Board. "Strange," he continued under the cover of applause, "that your son doesn't know you're the quiet partner behind the very company serving tonight's meal." His eyes glinted with mischief. "Half this ballroom is eating because of you." The breath caught in my chest. I hadn't expected to meet anyone here who knew about those investments. I had tucked them away under holding companies masked behind neutral names, ensuring that Damon believed I lived on little more than my pension and Social Security. I pressed a finger to my lips. "Please," I whispered. He inclined his head, amused but respectful, before retreating into the crowd. The irony spread through me like heat, while Damon mocked me as penniless guests sipped champagne chilled in tubs provided by a catering firm that existed only because I had once written a discreet check when their founder needed a loan. He had paid me back in shares, and those shares had blossomed into something Damon never dreamed his mother could hold. I folded my napkin, slowly laid it across my lap, and lifted my glass. Around me, the toasts continued, a parade of voices lauding Clarice's beauty and the Vale family's refinement. I let them talk. Let Damon shine. For now, the chandeliers sparkled above him as he basked in applause, unaware that the ground beneath his new life was less solid than he believed. I sat in silence, my heart steadying not from pride, but from resolve. There would be a time to speak, and when it came, silence would no longer be my shield, but my weapon. And so the night went on, the music swelling, the laughter rising, my secret fortune humming in the background. Like the turbines on the land Damon had never cared to visit. I remained still, preparing for the storm that would follow. The ride back from the wedding blurred into silence. Connecticut's rolling fields passed by in a haze of headlights, but my thoughts were elsewhere, on the word Damon had hurled so casually in front of 200 people. Broke. A word he never bothered to ask me about, never thought to question. Perhaps because I had made it too easy for him to believe. The truth of my life was far less simple. Nearly 40 years ago, when my grandparents passed, they left me a stretch of land out in western Massachusetts. Everyone said it was worthless rocky soil, too much wind, not enough water. While Frank and I were raising Damon on a teacher's salary and my wages from the district office, we paid the taxes and let the fields sit idle. Friends teased me that I was holding on to a pile of nothing, but I couldn't bring myself to sell. Something in my bones told me land was never truly nothing. 20 years later, that same worthless property became the site of a regional wind farm. The company's executives called it perfect, steady gusts, unobstructed ridges. They offered me a lease that seemed small at first, then grew into steady checks that climbed with each new turbine they planted. The day the first royalty check arrived, I tucked it into an envelope and whispered to Frank, "Maybe we'll be able to breathe a little easier." He only smiled relief, softening the lines cancer had already begun to etch across his face. When Frank died, I had no heart for grand gestures. I went back to work, back to the library shelves and budget ledgers, back to the comfort of routine. But the checks kept coming, and soon other opportunities followed. A colleague from my consulting work at the Energy Board called with a tip, a small Nevada firm exploring mineral rights near an old copper site. Most investors scoffed. I didn't. I bought in quietly, just enough to matter. When lithium surged into demand for batteries, those dusty rights grew more valuable than gold. By the time Damon graduated college, my accounts had swelled beyond anything he could imagine. Yet I still lived in the same colonial house in Hartford, its paint a little chipped, its shutters a little crooked. I drove a sensible car, wore the same wool coats through more winters than I can count, clipped coupons for groceries out of habit rather than need. I kept quiet. It wasn't humility alone. It was a choice. I had seen too many people shift their eyes the moment money entered the room, as though the person before them became something else, entirely less mother, less neighbor, less friend, more asset. Frank used to say, respect built on numbers falls the minute those numbers vanish. I carried those words with me like scripture. So I tested the world. Who would still call? Who would still invite me over? Who would still ask my opinion if they believed I had little more than a pension? Damon, it seemed, no longer did. Perhaps he never truly had. My modest life was my disguise, but also my armor. Every bill I paid in cash, every time I packed a lunch, instead of dining out, every moment I stayed behind the scenes rather than stepping into them, it was all part of a vow. Let no one know unless they've earned the right to stand in that truth. That night after the wedding, I laid my dress across the armchair and sat at the edge of my bed, listening to the hum of the old radiator. Damon's laughter at my expense still rang in my ears, but so did the whisper of that colleague at the table. Strange he doesn't know you bankrolled part of this catering company. The irony gnawed at me. The very fortune I had hidden was woven into the fabric of his perfect wedding, yet he had mocked me as though I were begging for scraps. I folded Frank's old robe across my lap and thought of the promise I had once made myself silence until someone proved they valued the woman, not the wealth. Damon had failed the test, and I had the sinking feeling that others around him would soon follow. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the curtains, I knew I would have to decide how much longer my silence could serve me, and whether keeping my fortune hidden would protect me or betray me in the end. The morning after the wedding, my head still buzzed with fragments of laughter and the sting of Damon's words. Yet there was no time to dwell. Clarice had arranged a brunch at the estate for close family, and I was expected to attend. The Vale estate was as intimidating in daylight as it had been under chandeliers. Expansive lawns unfurled toward stone fountains, and staff in crisp uniforms glided between tables set beneath white tents. Guests strolled with the ease of people who had never worried about mortgage payments or overdue bills. Clarice, all grace and pearls, greeted me at the entrance. She looked flawless. Her smile polished her perfume, expensive yet subtle. "Mother Hart," she said, slipping an arm through mine as though we had always been close. "Come, I'd love for you to meet my mother properly." Beatrix Vale stood near a table laden with pastries, her posture so straight it seemed carved. She was striking in a severe way, her silver hair swept into a knot, her dress understated but obviously costly. Her eyes scanned me with the efficiency of a jeweler assessing a stone. "Beatrix, this is Damon's mother," Evelina, Clarice announced. Beatrix extended her hand with warmth that felt rehearsed. "At last," she said, "I've heard so much about you." I placed my hand in hers, noting the coolness of her fingers. "All good things, I hope." "Of course," she replied smoothly, though her gaze flicked down to my shoes. Sensible flats I'd polished that morning, and then back to my face. "Clarice tells me you live in Hartford. A little apartment, isn't it?" The words slid out with honey, yet carried the sting of vinegar. My apartment was modest, yes, but it was mine, every inch paid for in cash. To her, though, it was a detail to file under insufficient. Before I could respond, Damon joined us. His tie loosened his cheeks, still flushed with the glow of celebration. "Mom keeps it simple," he said, laughing lightly. "Always has. Makes life easier, doesn't it?" Beatrix's smile widened. "Practicality can be charming, though of course some environments call for a little more refinement." Damon chuckled, eager to prove he understood her world. I watched the exchange in silence, my chest tightening. Only hours earlier he had mocked me in front of strangers, and now he laughed along while his new mother-in-law dismissed the life I had built. Clarice leaned close, her voice soft but pointed. "You'll find, Evelina, that the Vale family takes presentation very seriously. It isn't just vanity, it's about maintaining standards." I sipped from the glass of water I held, letting the coolness steady me. Presentation. Standards. Words dressed up to conceal judgment. I had heard them before in whispers at school board meetings, in glances from wealthier parents at fundraisers. Yet coming from my son's new wife, they pressed deeper. Around us, laughter bubbled from the other tables. The Vale cousins exchanged stories of vacations in the Hamptons Charity Gala's new art purchases. I thought of my own neighbors who gathered around back porches to share pie recipes and complain about taxes. Different worlds, and my son was planting his feet firmly in theirs. Beatrix tilted her head as if considering me for a role I hadn't auditioned for. "It must be comforting having Damon settled here now," she said. "He'll be well provided for, and of course you'll always be welcome to visit. Though I imagine city living suits you better." It wasn't an invitation, it was a dismissal disguised as courtesy. My place, according to her, was outside their circle. I smiled politely the way I had learned to do when students' parents implied librarians were merely glorified clerks. "City living has always suited me," I said evenly. Beatrix's eyes lingered on me a moment longer, sharp as a scalpel, before she turned to greet another guest. Damon, oblivious, was already laughing at a cousin's story, leaving me standing there with the taste of dismissal heavy in my mouth. The shadows of old battles fighting for dignity in rooms that measured worth by bank accounts were creeping back. Only this time, the battlefield was my son's new family. I knew then that brunch was not a welcome, but a weighing. And in their scales, I had already been found lacking. Later that afternoon, Clarice suggested I rest for a while. "The festivities can be overwhelming," she said with her polished smile, as if I were already too fragile to keep up. A housemaid led me into the estate's library, a grand room lined with shelves that smelled faintly of leather and lemon polish. I welcomed the solitude. The Vale estate pulsed with chatter and footsteps, and I longed for quiet to collect my thoughts. I moved slowly between the shelves, running my fingers along volumes that looked untouched. Most of the titles were for display leather-bound histories, gilded spines of poetry classics, arranged by color rather than content. It was a library built to impress, not to be read. A coffee table sat near the hearth, its surface scattered with magazines and a few folders. I wasn't looking for anything when I saw it, but once my eyes caught the neat handwriting across the top page, my breath caught. My name. I sank into the armchair and leaned forward. The folder lay partly open as though someone had set it down in haste. On the first page, underlined in careful strokes, were the words, "Power of Attorney." My fingers trembled as I turned the page. Behind it was a healthcare proxy form, my name penciled into the blanks, the date left empty. Tucked beside it was a glossy brochure with a photograph of a manicured lawn and smiling seniors gathered around a pianist. Golden Crest, living security, comfort, and community for your loved ones. I had never heard of Golden Crest, but there was no mistaking the implication. My son's new family had already begun planning a future in which I was not only dependent, but also managed. I let the folder fall shut, my pulse hammering in my ears. 1,000 memories collided in that moment, working double shifts to cover Damon's tuition clipping coupons for years, eating casseroles stretched over 3 nights, so he could have music lessons, borrowing books from the library instead of buying them, so we could save for his field trips. Frank and I had fought to give him a foundation, and now, instead of respect, I was being penciled into documents as though my life were a business asset awaiting liquidation. The humiliation of his speech the night before had cut deep, but this was worse. This was calculation. The door creaked softly behind me. I straightened at once, the folder closed beneath my hand. Beatrix stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the hall light. "I trust you're comfortable here?" she asked smoothly. Stepping into the room, I rose, keeping my tone steady. "Quite comfortable, thank you." Her gaze flicked to the coffee table, lingering for a fraction of a second too long. She knew. She knew what I had seen, and I knew she was measuring whether I would speak. I smiled, polite as ever, and shifted away from the table. "It's a lovely library." "Yes," she replied, her voice cool, though it needs curating. "Some things can't be left unattended." We stood there in silence, 2 women bound by an unspoken understanding. She was staking her ground, and I was quietly marking mine. When she finally turned and swept back into the hallway, I lowered myself once more into the armchair. My heart was still racing, but not from fear, from clarity. They were planning my removal as neatly as one files away paperwork, and they thought I wouldn't notice. I folded my hands in my lap and stared at the shut folder, the glossy brochure peeking from its edge. I wouldn't confront them now, not yet. First, I would map the storm, and when the time came, they would learn I was not the fragile woman they believed, but the quiet storm they never saw coming. The week after the wedding, I drove to Lucian Rowe's office in downtown Hartford. The building was plain brick, unremarkable, the kind of place you'd pass without a second glance. That was Lucian's way. No flash, just steadiness. We'd known each other since Frank was alive when Lucian helped us put together our first will. Over the years, he'd become less lawyer, more confidant. He rose when I entered tall and trim in his gray suit, spectacles glinting in the morning light. "Evelina," he said warmly, "you look tired." "Tired is easier than saying betrayed," I replied, settling into the chair across from him. I told him everything: Damon's speech, Beatrix's barbed courtesies, and finally, the folder on the coffee table. As I spoke, Lucian's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "They already have forms with your name?" he asked. "Yes," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Power of attorney healthcare proxy and a brochure for a place called Golden Crest Living." Lucian leaned back, steepling his fingers. Classic move. "Get you to sign under the guise of safety, then transfer control piece by piece. You'd be amazed how often I see it." "I'm not signing a thing." "Good. Don't. Document everything, Evelina. Every word, every glance that feels wrong, write it down. Keep copies of anything you find. Paper can be a weapon sharper than any knife." He paused, his eyes softening. "And patience is your ally. Don't rush to confront them. Let them reveal themselves." I nodded, the tension in my chest loosening a fraction. "So I wait." "You wait," he confirmed. "And when the time comes, you'll have more than words to stand on." Leaving Lucian's office, I felt steadier. Not safe, but braced like a ship, turning its prow toward rough seas with sails properly tied. That evening, I sat on my porch with Mrs. Lark, my neighbor of 20 years. She was a wiry woman with a sharp tongue, the kind of friend who didn't bother dressing truth in lace. We sipped tea from chipped mugs as the cicadas droned in the warm dusk. "Golden Crest, you say," she scoffed when I told her. "That's a fancy way of saying warehouse for the inconvenient." I smiled faintly. "They think it's inevitable." Her eyes narrowed fierce, even under her halo of gray curls. "Rich folks never ask, Evelina. They take. First your seat at the table, then your voice, then your home. And if you let them, they'll take the skin off your back too." I stared into my mug, the steam curling upward. "What if Damon believes them?" "Then he's forgotten who raised him," she said flatly. "But don't you forget who you are. You've survived too much to hand yourself over like a parcel." Her words cut through the heaviness I carried. Between Lucian's counsel and Mrs. Lark's bluntness, I felt my spine straighten again. They thought I was alone, that my silence meant weakness. But shadows could be allies too, and mine were watching with me. When the porch lights flickered on, I knew I had the beginnings of a plan. A week later, Clarice insisted I join her and Beatrix for a dress fitting at an upscale boutique on Main Street. "It'll be fun," she said, though her tone suggested it was more obligation than joy. I suspected the invitation was less about inclusion and more about evaluation. The boutique smelled of lavender and starch. Rows of gowns in pastel silks and muted satins lined the walls, their prices stitched discreetly inside tags that I knew could cover a month of rent. Beatrix greeted me with her usual poise, a subtle perfume trailing behind her as she ushered me toward a fitting room. "You'll want something more polished for the upcoming events," she said smoothly, her eyes gliding over my modest navy dress. "A mother of the groom should always look her best." Her words were framed as kindness, but her gaze felt like judgment. I bit back the urge to remind her that I had managed just fine dressing myself for 70 years. Inside the fitting room, an attendant draped a pale lavender suit over my shoulders, adjusting the collar, while Beatrix observed from her seat like a queen before her court. "It softens her, don't you think?" Beatrix murmured to Clarice. Clarice nodded, but her smile was fixed. I stood in front of the mirror, my reflection both familiar and foreign. I had spent decades choosing clothes for practicality, sturdy shoes, warm coats, work-ready skirts. Now I was being dressed as though my worth depended on how closely I could blend into their curated world. Between fittings, as the attendant fetched another dress, Beatrix leaned closer. Her voice dropped smooth as silk. "Don't worry, Evelina. We'll ensure you're taken care of." The words struck harder than if she'd raised her voice. Taken care of. Not respected, not included, managed. As though my independence were already surrendered, my choices already erased. I held her gaze in the mirror, my face calm though my pulse quickened. "I've taken care of myself a long time," I said quietly. Beatrix's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. But everyone reaches a point where it's better to let others handle the burdens." The attendant returned with another gown, breaking the moment, but the message had already been delivered. I was being reframed, not as Evelina Hartwoman, mother, widow, survivor, but as a dependent to be placed neatly in their picture, posed where I couldn't disrupt the scenery. I slipped into the gown, the fabric cool against my skin, and turned back to the mirror. Outwardly, I looked every bit the part of their polished society, but beneath the satin, I carried something Beatrix couldn't see resolve. When the fitting ended, Clarice chattered about accessories. Beatrix nodded approval, and I thanked the attendant with the courtesy they never thought to offer. My smile never wavered, but inside, I felt the snare tightening, and I knew then that if they were writing me out of the picture, I would have to decide which frame to break first. That night, I sat in my kitchen with the lights dimmed, the lavender suit still hanging in its garment bag on the back of the chair. The silence of my house felt heavier than usual, pressing against my ribs. I kept replaying Beatrix's words, "Will ensure you're taken care of," and the way Damon had chuckled, as if her casual dismissal of me were harmless. I poured a cup of tea and let the steam curl into the air. My mind wandered back years to a spring afternoon when Damon was only 12. He had always been small for his age, lean and wiry with a shock of hair that never lay flat, no matter how I brushed it. That day, I arrived at the schoolyard just in time to see a cluster of boys circling another child, a quiet boy named Samuel, who lived 2 streets over. They shoved him back and forth, laughing as his books scattered. Before I could call out, Damon darted into the circle. He planted himself between Samuel and the bullies, his fists clenched, though he was outnumbered 3-1. "Leave him alone," he said, his voice trembling but steady. The other boys jeered. "What are you gonna do, Hart?" "You're half our size." "Doesn't matter," Damon replied. "Pick on someone else." They shoved him too, and he fell hard, scraping his knee on the gravel. But he got up again, dusted himself off, and repeated the words, "Leave him alone." Eventually, the boys grew bored and wandered off, muttering under their breath. Damon knelt to help Samuel gather his books, his own jeans torn and bloody at the knee. When I reached him, his eyes glistened, but he smiled. He needed someone, he whispered to me later that evening when I patched him up at the kitchen table. And I was there. That moment had seared itself into me, not just his bravery, but the compassion behind it. Damon hadn't thought of his own safety, only of someone else's dignity. I held on to that memory now, like a lifeline. The man who laughed along with Beatrix was the same boy who once shielded Samuel. Somewhere beneath the charm and the hunger for approval, that boy still existed. I had to believe it. It would be easier to give in to bitterness, to sharpen my silence into vengeance and strike when they least expected it. But revenge was never Frank's way nor mine. Frank had believed in dignity, even when the world handed him less. The high road is harder to climb, he used to say, but the view is worth it. I touched the edge of his old photograph on the mantel, his smile frozen in time. I whispered aloud, "I'll fight Frank, but I'll fight with dignity." That decision settled in me like a stone at the bottom of a river, heavy, immovable grounding. Beatrix and Clarice could spin their plans. Damon could stumble in their shadow. But I would not let them turn me into a dependent, a figure to be moved like a pawn. I would fight with the tools I knew best, patience, evidence, and the truth no one could erase. And maybe, just maybe, I could remind Damon of the boy who once stood in a schoolyard, fists trembling, heart steady, defending someone weaker than himself. I sipped my tea, the warmth spreading through me. Tomorrow I would call Lucian again. There were papers to prepare, protections to strengthen, and lines to draw more firmly than ever before. The suit in its garment bag rustled faintly as the night breeze moved through the room, like a reminder of the frame they wanted to lock me into. I stared at it and made a silent promise I would not let them choose the picture. The following week, I sat across from Lucian's desk with a pen in my hand and a knot in my chest. The office smelled faintly of old paper and ink, the kind of scent that reminded me of the library stacks I'd once cared for. But this wasn't cataloging books. This was drawing lines that no one could cross without consequence. Lucian slid the first draft of the trust toward me. "This will put everything in order," he said. His tone was calm, but I caught the sharpness in his eyes. "They won't expect you to have already locked the doors." I scanned the pages. The structure was clean, a living trust that would outlive me and carry my wishes like stone carved in law. At its heart, I created a charitable fund grants for students from families like mine, scholarships for the children of line workers who kept the turbines turning, stipends for apprentices who wanted to learn the science of clean energy but had no family money to fall back on. I imagined Frank smiling at that. He'd always said opportunity was worth more than inheritance. The second section spelled out Damon's share. He would inherit, but only under conditions. If he respected the boundaries of my independence, no coercion, no attempts to seize control of my decisions, his portion would remain intact. But if he signed his name to schemes like the folder I'd seen on the Vale coffee table, his rights would evaporate. "Harsh?" I asked quietly. Lucian shook his head. "Protective. Conditions aren't punishment, they're clarity. You're drawing the line between love and control." I nodded, though my hand trembled as I traced the ink across the page. The final clause was buried deeper, invisible to a casual glance. If my estate was ever taken under duress through power of attorney abuse, guardianship petitions, or asset transfer, then everything, every dollar and share, would bypass both Damon and the Vales. Instead, it would flow directly into the Hart Stewardship Fund to be administered by a board of educators and energy advocates. In other words, if they tried to steal it, they'd lose it all. I sat back in my chair, letting the weight of that twist settle over me. They thought I was a pawn on their board, fragile enough to move into Golden Crest with a pen stroke. What they didn't know was that the board itself had been redesigned. Lucian handed me the final page to sign. "This is your fortress," he said softly. "It doesn't shout, it waits. If they come, the walls will hold." I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name with a steady hand. When I left his office, the winter air bit at my cheeks, but I felt stronger than I had in weeks. The streets of Hartford looked the same, cars rushing past storefronts lit for the season. But to me, everything shimmered with quiet certainty. The veils might circle, Damon might falter, but my life was no longer open ground. It was a fortress, silent but immovable. That night, I folded the trust papers into my fireproof box and set the key in its place. Then I brewed a pot of tea and sat at the window, the city lights flickering like sentinels beyond the glass. The rehearsal dinner glowed with the kind of polish that only money can buy. Crystal vases of white orchids stood like sentinels down the center of each table, and the cutlery shone so brightly it nearly hurt my eyes. Servers moved in seamless choreography, pouring champagne as if the bubbles themselves carried status. I took my seat near the edge of the long banquet table. Not exiled, but not included either, just close enough to be seen without being heard. I had learned to recognize that kind of placement long ago when Frank and I used to attend school fundraisers. The people who mattered sat in the middle where conversations overlapped and influence pooled. The rest of us hovered at the border's polite accessories. Clarice rose for her toast, her sequined dress catching the light. She looked every inch the veiled daughter practiced smile, steady poise. She lifted her glass and began. "We are gathered not only to celebrate our union, but to honor the family that has made this possible." She said, her eyes sweeping first to Beatrix, then across the table to Damon. "My parents have always taught me that true security comes from strong roots. Tonight we welcome Damon into that legacy. Whatever storms may come, he has a family to lean on, a family that will never let him fall." Applause spread like a ripple, but I stayed still. The words landed heavily in my chest. He has a family to lean on, as if the decades Frank and I had spent building Damon's foundation had dissolved into dust, as if his future stability were owed entirely to them, their name, their fortune. Damon raised his glass, smiling, eager to reflect Clarice's glow. He didn't glance my way, not once. I sipped my water and let the taste of lemon bite the inside of my cheek. Silence once again would serve me better than protest. After the toasts, guests milled about the room, laughter rising with the clinking of glasses. I excused myself to stretch my legs and found a quiet corner near the terrace doors. That's when I heard them. Two of Clarice's bridesmaids whispering near the floral arrangements. "Make sure her mom doesn't get near the mic tomorrow," one said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Clarice wants everything seamless." The other giggled. "Can you imagine that old dress and those tired stories? She'd ruin the aesthetic." The words slid under my skin, sharp as needles, but instead of anger, I felt an odd calm settle over me. They wanted me silenced, invisible. And yet it was my silence that had built the very walls they mistook for weakness. I stepped back into the hall before they could notice me. A server passed with a tray of petit fours, and I took one, biting into the chocolate with measured composure. If they thought I would embarrass myself, they were wrong. I would not stumble. I would not plead. I would wait. At the table, Beatrix leaned toward Damon, whispering something that made him laugh. Clarice rested her hand over his, her expression triumphant. It was all a performance, every glance, rehearsed, every word, calibrated. But I had seen performances before, and I knew something they didn't, even the most polished mask cracks under pressure. I returned to my seat, folded my napkin across my lap, and smiled. Not the smile of someone defeated, but of someone who had already chosen her battlefield. The orchids gleamed in the candlelight, their petals pristine. But I thought of my roses at home, tougher flowers that bloomed through harsh New England winters. Strength wasn't in polish, it was in endurance. I let the smile remain fixed on my lips, even as my mind plotted the silence I would hold and the storm I would unleash when the time was right. The wedding day unfolded like a stage play, each act choreographed, each smile rehearsed. The Vale estate glistened under the noon sun, every detail arranged to prove their wealth and refinement, orchids in towering vases, crystal glasses that rang like bells' violins, threading through the air like spun silk. I wore the lavender suit Beatrix had chosen, not because I wanted her approval, but because sometimes camouflage is more useful than armor. I moved among the guests quietly, a presence noted but unremarkable, and let them believe I was as harmless as I looked. The ceremony passed in a blur. Damon beamed as Clarice walked down the aisle, radiant in lace and satin. They spoke their vows beneath an arch of roses, their voices carrying across the manicured lawn. Guests dabbed their eyes. Cameras clicked, and I clapped politely when they sealed it with a kiss. It wasn't until the reception that the moment came. The ballroom shimmered with candlelight, the chandeliers raining down brilliance on every polished surface. Toasts flowed like wine, Clarice's cousins recalling childhood mischief. Beatrix thanking everyone for their generosity, friends telling stories that left the crowd roaring. Then Damon rose microphone in hand, his cheeks flushed from champagne and triumph. My beautiful wife, Clarice, has given me everything I could ever want. He began, his arms sweeping around her shoulders. And her family has welcomed me into their world with such generosity. I'm grateful beyond words. The applause was warm, indulgent. He paused, smiling toward me. And my mom, he said, his voice carrying over the laughter and clinking glasses. She's always kept life simple. I guess when you're broke, you don't have much choice. The words cut clean through the music, and for a beat, the room laughed with him, not cruelly, but with the ease of people who assumed I was in on the joke. I kept my eyes steady on him even as the laughter rippled through the hall. Broke. Again that word. A child's ignorance once might have been forgivable, but now it was a man's dismissal sharpened for an audience. I rose slowly, smoothing my skirt. The laughter faded as chairs scraped and heads turned. May I say a few words? I asked. My voice was calm, unshaken. Clarice stiffened her hand, tightening on Damon's. Beatrix's lips pressed thin. The bridesmaids exchanged nervous glances, but the microphone was already in my hand. I turned to the guests, smiling gently. Thank you all for celebrating Damon and Clarice today. It has been a joy to watch my son grow into a man, to see him stand here ready to build his own family. I have no gift as grand as these flowers, no inheritance of pearls or paintings, but I do have something to share. From my purse, I drew a small recorder. Lucian had helped me preserve it years ago when Frank's voice was still strong, but his body was fading. I pressed play. The speakers filled with Frank's voice, steady, warm, unmistakable. To my Evelina, it began the best steward our family could ever have. You managed every bill, stretched every dollar, gave us stability when I could not. You built a life from hard work and quiet wisdom. If anyone doubts what wealth looks like, they need only look at you. The room fell utterly silent. Not even the clink of glass broke the stillness. I let the message play to the end, Frank's final words carrying into the corners of the ballroom. You are our foundation, Evelina, and Damon, never forget what your mother has done for us. Honor her, for she is the richest soul I've ever known. The recording clicked off. I held the microphone steady, my gaze sweeping the room. Broke, I said softly, is a word for pockets, not for character. The silence was absolute. Damon's face drained of color. Clarice stared fixedly at the table, and Beatrix's jaw tightened like stone. Guests shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between me and the couple at the head table. I handed the microphone back to the nearest server, inclined my head politely, and returned to my seat. My hands did not tremble, nor did my smile falter. The silence I had carried for so long had finally shattered. And in the fragments, I could already see the cracks spreading further than they ever anticipated. The applause never came. After Frank's voice faded, the room had frozen into a hush thick enough to choke on. The orchestra resumed cautiously, and people clapped out of politeness, but the air was heavy with unease. I ate my slice of cake in silence, finished my coffee, and prepared to leave. That was when Clarice's hand clamped onto Damon's arm, her whisper sharp enough for me to hear across the table. We need to talk. Now. Minutes later, I found myself ushered into a side chamber, off the ballroom, a small parlor with velvet chairs and a gilt mirror. The door shut behind us with a thud that carried more menace than any words. Beatrix's mask cracked first. Her composure shattered into fury, her eyes flashing like ice catching light. "How dare you humiliate us in front of our guests?" she hissed. I met her glare evenly. It wasn't humiliation. It was truth. Clarice's lips curled venom hidden behind her practiced elegance. "You've ruined what was supposed to be the perfect day. Do you have any idea how long I've worked for this family to accept me?" Damon stood off to the side, his face flushed, rubbing the back of his neck like a boy caught misbehaving. "Mom," he muttered, "you didn't have to." I turned to him, my voice calm but firm. "Didn't have to? What, defend myself after you mocked me as broke Damon? You laughed at me in front of 200 people. And you think my silence would have honored you more?" He winced, eyes darting toward Clarice. "I didn't mean it like that. Intent doesn't erase impact," I replied. Beatrix stepped closer, her heels clicking on the polished floor. "Enough. We've tolerated your little dramatics, Evelina, but this ends here. No more scenes, no more surprises. From now on, you'll leave family decisions to those of us who know how to handle them." Family decisions, I repeated, letting the words linger, such as power of attorney documents left lying on your coffee table, or brochures for Golden Crest with my name scribbled in. Beatrix's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Clarice glanced at Damon, startled, then back at me, her composure faltering for the first time. I straightened my shoulders. "Listen carefully. I will not sign a single document that gives away my autonomy. I will not be shuttled off to Golden Crest or anywhere else without my consent. I will not be silenced at family gatherings, and I will not be treated as a liability to be managed. That era is over." The silence in the room was heavier than the chandeliers outside. Damon shifted his face, pale shame flickering across it. Clarice bit her lip, furious but unsure. Beatrix's hands were clenched at her sides, her nails digging crescents into her palms. I picked up my purse from the velvet chair and slung it over my arm. "You can plan your perfect family picture without me, if that's what you prefer. But understand this, I walk out with my dignity intact. And I won't come back to this room until respect walks in with me." With that, I turned and opened the door. The orchestra swelled outside, violins filling the air like nothing had happened. I stepped into the light, my heels steady on the marble floor. For the first time since this war had begun, it was I who left the battlefield first, yet it was they who stood defeated behind closed doors. The morning after the wedding, I awoke with the same clarity I had carried out of that parlor. My silence had ended, and with it, their assumption of control. Still, I knew better than to believe one speech would stop a machine already in motion. The Vales had influence money, and the arrogance of people who believed they could bend law to will. That was why I called Lucian. By afternoon, I was seated across from him again this time, with a folder between us thicker than before. Lucian's pen scratched steadily across a set of letters, his tone clipped. These will be delivered by courier to the Vale family's attorneys. Clear, professional, and legally binding desist from any attempt at coercion or guardianship petitions. Any violation, Evelina and we bring it directly to probate court. He looked up, his glasses catching the light. Once these are in their hands, they'll know you're not alone. A pulse of relief ran through me. For weeks I had been carrying the weight in silence. Now, finally, the balance was shifting. When I returned home, I opened my laptop and began another kind of preparation. For years, I had saved my phone logs, my emails, and even offhand text messages. Librarian habits, they called it clutter. I called it record-keeping. Now, those quiet habits became my armor. I compiled screenshots of text chains Damon had sent me. Clarice thinks we should start planning ahead for your safety. Another mom, don't fight this. They know what's best for you. And one late at night that stung worst of all. She says you'll come around once you see how manageable things could be. Manageable. That word, like Beatrix's taken care of, dripped with possession. I arranged the files into a digital folder labeled plainly receipts. Copies went to a cloud drive, one to a flash drive in my fireproof box, another printed for Lucian's archive. I would not be erased, not by convenience or by signatures forged through pressure. 2 days later, Damon appeared at my door. He looked unshaven, circles under his eyes betraying sleepless nights. I hesitated before letting him in, but something in his expression made me step aside. "Mom," he began, his voice low. "Clarice said you embarrassed her family, that you planned that whole stunt to hurt her." I gestured to the couch. "Sit down, Damon." He sank onto the cushions, elbows on his knees. But then I saw the texts. The ones she sent me. About managing you. About making sure you didn't get in the way of her plans. She said it was just strategy, that every family has to streamline responsibility. His voice cracked. It didn't sound like strategy. It sounded like control. I placed a printed page in his hands, a copy of one of his own messages. He stared at it, then dropped his head into his palms. "She made it sound like we were protecting you," he whispered. But really, she was protecting her own image. I sat beside him, keeping my tone even. Damon, protecting me means listening to me, respecting me, not managing me. He nodded slowly, shame tightening his features. "I don't know who to believe anymore." "Believe what you see," I said softly. "The receipts are right in front of you." We sat in silence, the kind that stretches not from distance but from recognition. The boy who once defended Samuel was flickering in him again, faint but alive. Finally, Damon rose. "I need to think," he said, his voice unsteady. "But Mom, I'm starting to see things I didn't want to see before." When the door closed behind him, I exhaled slowly, my hands still resting on the printed pages. Truth had begun its knock. Whether Damon opened the door or bolted, it was now up to him. I asked Damon to come by for tea the following Sunday. It was the same kitchen he'd grown up in, though the wallpaper was new and the teapot older than both of us. He arrived on time, shoulders hunched, eyes darting around, like he wasn't sure whether he was a guest or an intruder. "Sit," I said gently, pouring 2 cups. "You always liked honey better than sugar." He managed a faint smile as he took the cup. For a moment, Silence stretched between us, heavy, but not hostile. He inhaled the steam as though the warmth itself might steady him. "Mom," he said finally, "I need to know why. Why all the secrecy? Why hide everything you've done, everything you've saved? It made you look small, like you didn't have anything." I leaned back, folding my hands in my lap. That was the point. I wanted to see who valued me for who I was not, for what I could give. Money is a magnifying glass, Damon. It can make love look bigger, but it can't make it real. His brow furrowed. "So all these years you've been testing us." "Not testing," I corrected softly. "Protecting." Frank and I made a decision we wouldn't flaunt what we had. We wanted to know if the people around us cared about us, not about accounts or deeds. And now, after your speech at the wedding, I have my answer. He winced, looking down into his cup. I was stupid. I thought I was being funny, fitting in with Clarice's crowd. But when Dad's voice played, he stopped swallowing hard. I've never felt smaller. I let him sit, with the shame not rushing to soothe him. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. "What do I do now? I can't undo it." "No," I said, my voice steady. "But you can choose differently going forward." I reached for the folder I'd kept tucked beneath a stack of cookbooks and slid it across the table. Damon hesitated before opening it. Inside were pages of trust documents neat as stone. His eyes widened as he read the conditions. "Mom, this says I only inherit if I protect you. If I safeguard the household from outside interference. Correct. And if I don't, then your share goes to the Heart Stewardship Fund. Scholarships for students who remind me of you at 12, the ones who need someone to stand for them." He blinked, then frowned. "And this clause here about Beatrix," I met his gaze without flinching. "It states plainly, your inheritance is conditional on keeping her influence out of my affairs. No power of attorney, no senior homes without my request, no coercion, direct or indirect. If she tries and you allow it, you lose everything." The color drained from his face. "Clarice will never accept this. Then she'll reveal where her loyalty lies," I replied. "And so will you." He set the folder down slowly, his fingers trembling. "You're asking me to choose between my wife and my mother. I'm asking you to choose between dignity and control," I corrected. "If you build your marriage on submission to Beatrix, it will collapse. If you build it on respect for yourself, for Clarice, and for me, it might stand." The room went quiet again. Damon stared at the papers as though they were a mirror, showing him a reflection he wasn't ready to face. Finally, he closed the folder, his jaw tight. "I need time," he said. "You'll have it," I answered. He rose, kissed my cheek briefly awkwardly, and left the house with the folder clutched under his arm. I stood at the window, watching him walk down the path. His steps were slow, heavy, like a man carrying a weight too large to set down. But for the first time, I believed he might yet turn toward the boy I once raised. Beatrix called it a family council, as though it were a board meeting, rather than a trap. The invitation arrived in gilded stationery, but the intent was clear long before I stepped through the double doors of the Vale dining room. The table stretched like a runway, polished so bright I could see my own face staring back at me. At its head sat Beatrix, pearls around her neck like armor. Clarice perched on her right lips, pressed into a thin line. Damon stood off to the side, silent, as though he hadn't yet chosen a seat. Evelina Beatrix began, her voice honeyed but sharp. "We've gathered out of concern. You've caused disruptions at the wedding, in private conversations. We believe it's time to consider how best to care for you moving forward." care?" I repeated, letting the word sit between us. Clarice leaned forward, her tone rehearsed. "You seemed confused at the rehearsal dinner, forgetful. And your speech at the reception, well, it didn't show the best judgment. People are talking." I folded my hands neatly in my lap. "People? Or just you?" Beatrix ignored the barb, her smile tightening. "We can't allow instability to jeopardize Damon's future. Families must be strong, unified. And unfortunately, Evelina, you're becoming a liability." The word hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, I caught Damon's face reflected in the gleaming table. His eyes flickered, his jaw clenched. Something inside him was shifting. Clarice reached for his hand. "Darling, you know it's true. Your mother is unpredictable. We're only thinking of her safety and yours," Beatrix added smoothly. "Golden Crest would be an excellent solution. You could visit her anytime free from worry, and her affairs could be handled properly." I said nothing. Sometimes silence reveals more than protest. I let their words coil in the air until they began to sound cruel, even to their own ears. That was when Damon spoke, his voice low but unsteady. "Stop." Beatrix turned toward him, startled. "Excuse me, I heard what you just said," he replied louder this time. "Calling my mother a liability. Talking about putting her away like she's some obstacle." His fists tightened at his sides. "She raised me. She worked 2 jobs to get me through school, and you want to erase her because she doesn't fit your picture." Clarice's eyes widened. "Damon, you don't understand." "No," he cut in, his voice cracking. "I understand perfectly. I've been blind, and I let myself laugh along when you mocked her. But not anymore." Beatrix's face hardened. "You're emotional. This is bigger than sentiment. Bigger than family," he shot back. "Bigger than respect." The silence that followed was different this time, not heavy with their control, but with his defiance. I watched him, my heart breaking and mending at once. Beatrix's lips parted as if to retort, but Damon pushed back his chair before she could. The legs screeched against the polished floor, a sound as final as any gavel. "I won't be part of this," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. And in that moment, I knew something inside him had broken free. The following week, Damon asked me to meet him at Lucian Rowe's office. His voice on the phone had been measured almost formal, but beneath it, I heard the tremor of a man standing at a crossroads. When I arrived, Damon was already seated across from Lucian's oak desk, a pen laid neatly before him. He looked worn, his tie crooked, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. Clarice sat stiffly beside him, her posture perfect, her fingers gripping the handle of her designer bag as if it were a lifeline. Lucian glanced at me and gave the faintest nod. "We're here to finalize the agreements," he said smoothly, sliding the documents forward. "This prenup and supplemental trust language protect both households. Clarice receives security as Damon's wife, but Evelina's autonomy remains intact. Any attempt to coerce her voids. Damon's inheritance." Clarice's jaw tightened, though she tried to mask it with a brittle smile. "Surely this is unnecessary," she said, her tone light but laced with steel. "We're family now. We should trust one another." Lucian's gaze was unyielding. Trust is strongest when it's written in ink. Damon swallowed hard and picked up the pen. His hand trembled slightly as he signed the first page, then the next. With each stroke, the room seemed to grow heavier, as though the weight of generations pressed down. Clarice shifted in her chair. "Damon, think about what this means. You're letting her dictate our marriage before it even begins." He paused, pen hovering. "No, Clarice. I'm setting boundaries. For the first time, maybe ever. Her voice sharpened. Boundaries. She's manipulating you. Can't you see she wants control? I remained silent, watching Damon fight his own battle. He set the pen down and looked directly at her. You said my mother was a liability. I heard you. That wasn't concern, it was contempt. And I can't build a marriage on contempt. Her face blanched, then flushed scarlet. I was protecting us, she snapped. From her instability, from her interference. From her existence, he cut in. His voice cracked, but it carried a conviction I hadn't heard in years. You don't get to erase the woman who raised me. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The only sound was the quiet hum of Lucian's clock. Then, Damon picked up the pen again. He signed the final page with a flourish that seemed to drain the last of his hesitation. He pushed the papers back across the desk. Done. Clarice's chair scraped back violently as she stood. You've humiliated me, she hissed. You've chosen her over me. Damon rose slowly, his shoulders straight. I chose respect. If you can't live with that, then maybe you don't want a husband, you want a puppet. Her lips parted in shock, but no words came. She grabbed her bag, spun on her heels, and stormed out the door, slamming behind her with a crack that echoed through the office. Damon stood there staring at the closed door, his chest rising and falling, like a man who'd just broken surface after drowning. He turned to me, his eyes brimming. Mom, I'm sorry. For everything. I can't fix the past, but I can start now. I reached across the desk, covering his hand with mine. Then start by remembering who you are, Damon. The boy who stood up for Samuel. The man who can stand up now for himself, for me, for what's right. He nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. Lucian quietly gathered the signed documents, placing them into his case. The ink is dry, he said, and so is the line drawn. I exhaled slowly, feeling both the sting of Clarice's fury and the fragile relief of Damon's choice. Outside, I knew the storm was far from over, but the first crack had already run through their perfect mask. The auditorium smelled faintly of new paint and polished wood. Banners lined the stage with the emblem Lucian's assistant had designed, a rising sun over a line of turbines, the words Heart Stewardship Fund etched in clean blue lettering. Rows of students, parents, and community leaders filled the seats, their chatter buzzing with anticipation. I stood at the podium, hands resting lightly on the wood, and scanned the room. These were not the polished crowds of Vale galas or charity balls. These were electricians in work boots, single mothers clutching their children's hands, teenagers with worn backpacks resting by their feet. They were the faces Frank and I had always carried in our hearts, the faces that reminded us of who we were and why we worked so hard. Good evening? I began, my voice steady, though my chest ached with emotion. My name is Evelina Hart. For years, I've lived quietly, working in the library, raising a son, paying bills like anyone else. But behind that life, something was growing, a seed my husband and I planted together before he passed. A murmur rippled through the room as I opened the folder of documents Lucian had prepared. Tonight, I'm proud to announce the Heart Stewardship Fund. This fund will provide scholarships for students pursuing renewable energy studies, apprenticeships for those eager to learn the skills of tomorrow, and grants for families who simply need a chance. Applause rose, hesitant at first, then stronger. I let the sound wash over me, not as praise, but as confirmation that Frank's dream was alive. At the side of the stage, Damon stood watching. His suit was plain this time, no flashy tie, no pretense. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes followed every word. I continued. This isn't about wealth for its own sake. It's about responsibility. Money can gather dust in vaults or buy status symbols that fade, or it can change lives. Frank believed in the latter. So do I. Faces in the crowd lit up, hopeful, grateful, astonished. I felt tears prick my eyes but held them back. This was not about me. When the event ended, the audience lined up to shake my hand. Parents thanked me, students asked about application deadlines, teachers spoke of partnerships. Each word grounded me deeper into the purpose that had guided this decision. Damon waited until the line thinned. When he approached, he didn't speak right away. He just looked at the banners, then at me, then back at the students still buzzing with excitement. Finally, he whispered, "All this time, I thought you were hiding, that you had nothing, and now—" He trailed off, shaking his head. I touched his arm lightly. I wasn't hiding. I was waiting. Wealth is loud when it's used for status, but when it serves, it doesn't need to shout. His throat worked as he swallowed. "I mocked you for being broke. I see now you were rich in ways I couldn't even imagine. And you never needed anyone's applause." "No," I said softly. "Only respect." He lowered his eyes, then lifted them again, determination replacing shame. "You have it. From me. From now on." I smiled, faintly. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully. That would take time, but it was the beginning of something better, recognition. As the last of the crowd filtered out, I folded the folder of documents and handed it back to Lucian. The fund had a name now, a purpose, etched in law and ink. For the first time in months, I felt the storm clouds lift, and as Damon held the door open for me, I knew this was not the end of a battle. It was the start of a legacy. Spring crept gently into Hartford, soft rains washing the streets, clean buds pushing through the earth as if they had never known winter. I spent a Saturday morning on my knees in the garden bed beneath the kitchen window, pressing new rose cuttings into the soil. Frank had always loved roses, stubborn flowers that endured frost and bloom alike. I wanted them where I could see them every morning, their persistence a reminder of my own. As I brushed the dirt from my gloves, I heard a car door shut. Damon's voice followed quieter than usual. "Mom." He stood at the gate, hands in his pockets. No Clarice by his side. His suit was gone. He wore a plain jacket, sleeves rolled back, the image of a man who had stepped out of someone else's script and was trying to find his own. "Come in," I said, wiping my palms on a rag. We sat at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling over the roses outside. He looked at his hands for a long time before speaking. "I owe you more than one apology. For the speech. For the whispers I ignored. For letting them call you a liability while I stayed quiet." I poured tea, sliding a cup toward him. Words can wound, Damon, but they can also heal. Choose them carefully. His eyes glistened. I let respect slip away. I thought status mattered more. I see now it was never about money. It was about seeing you, really seeing you. The silence that followed was softer than any words. I reached across and touched his hand. "You've taken the first step back. That matters." He nodded, a faint relief loosening his shoulders. "Clarice doesn't understand. She says I've betrayed her by siding with you. The marriage." He sighed. It strained. I said nothing. Some lessons were his to learn, not mine to teach. We drank in quiet company, the roses swaying outside the window. For the first time in years, I felt not like a burden or a pawn, but like a woman whose dignity had been seen. Damon's apology did not erase the scars, but it planted something new, like the roses, fragile now yet promising. When he rose to leave, he lingered at the door. "I'll be back soon. Not to manage you, not to control. Just to visit, if that's all right. That's all I ever wanted, I said. After he left, I returned to the garden bed. The cuttings leaned toward the glass, already reaching for light. I whispered half to them, half to the memory of frank love may open doors, but only respect keeps them open. Outline.